Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock, and I just want to get started. I want to be really mindful of getting you out on time. A couple of things. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you for being here today. We have some excellent speakers that will talk to us about different different groups of communities and different services that we offer here at the city and in our county. Before I go any further, just want to remind you, the restrooms are right outside, men's to the left, women's to the right. We will have a 5-minute break. If at any point, I know sitting for many of us is very exhausting, so if you feel you have to stand up, stand in the back, that's perfectly fine. So our agenda today, we're going to obviously do a welcome and introductions. My name is Esther Fifelski, and I work for the City of Holland. I've been with the city for about 10 years. I'm the Human Relations Director. So the purpose of today's event is really to have some sort of community strategy to prepare for, respond to, mitigate, and restore community balance. We haven't had anything traumatic happen in our community in this area, but it's always good to come together, chat, and also know who's who, what are the resources in the community. So that really is the primary driving force. So I want to talk a little bit about working together as a community. I think it's really important for us. Oftentimes we don't talk about things that could happen in our community. We want to stay positive, but I think it's really important to have conversations early so that if something does happen, we have a good idea of who we could reach out to for assistance and who we should keep in the communication loop. Hi. So we also can do a lot of work beforehand. Education and building those community networks is very important. So the fact that we're even having conversations and we have the presenters that we have here today is vital to stay informed. And then if something does happen, we are keeping track of all of the attendees so that if something in our community does happen, we are able to reach out to each and every one of you and let you know these are the facts. So often when something happens in communities to disrupt balance, we become inundated with gossip, with untruths. So we want to make sure that we are communicating a consistent message so that everyone is well informed. We don't want to cause further panic. And oftentimes, when something does happen in a community, we start to see rumors pop up. So we want to make sure that we keep you, that we're partners, that we keep you well informed. And then I feel like keeping community balance is really important to do it all the time, to always be talking, bringing educational events and bringing people together to share information. Many of you have lots of information within your organizations. We tried to host different events here at the city, so if at any point anyone would like to host something, either here or at their locations, we'd be happy to co-sponsor you and make sure that we help you promote and make sure that you get visibility. So what is a hate crime? I am going to move up closer because I left my glasses at my desk. So that happens often, but so what is a hate crime? Intimidation, harassment, physical force, or threat of physical force. It can be directed against any person because of a person's real or perceived identity, whether it's color, disability, ethnic background, gender, national origin, race, religion, or sexual orientation. So the City of Holland, we have a resident complaint form online. You can either come to the city, come to the Human Relations Department. We can help you navigate where you need to be making communications, making connections with. And also, you can also do it online. And we provide access to you. It's very easy to get to. If you go to the city's main website and you go under How Do I. If you go all the way to the right of that page, you will see the citizen resident complaint link, and you can click right on it, and it will walk you right through the process. And you will receive a call within 24 hours if it's during the work week. If it's during the weekend, I'll get to you first thing Monday morning. All right, Captain Buursma.
Thanks, Esther. Like Esther said, my name is Bob Buursma. I'm with the Holland Department of Public Safety. I've been there for just over 25 years. Currently, I'm the services captain, and I was happy when Esther invited me to be involved in this, and welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. So my purpose in being here is I'm going to get involved in more the criminal side in what we have in the state of Michigan in terms of when it becomes a crime, and then when we get involved. One thing to keep in mind is, as a police agency, that's where we have authority when there's a crime. Other things can be illegal, but they don't become a crime. It can be a civil violation. For example, if you think of Elliot Larson, there's a lot of requirements in there that have to do with public accommodations and employment, all these different things where you can't discriminate based on people in certain situations, but that doesn't rise to a crime. Then the entity can be fined by the state can come in and make sanctions, but you're not sending an individual to jail for it. The same thing, because when I worked the road, we'd run into this once in a while. Somebody would come up and say, well, I just took a workplace sexual harassment training. This guy said this to me today. I want to press charges for that. It's like, well, we can't press charges for that. There's not a crime for that. You go to your employer because they have to create a safe environment. So the employer is required to take care of that, and they may have to fire the person or training, whatever, but that's not something we get involved in. So just keep that in mind. So where we get involved is when it does cross that threshold to where it becomes a criminal offense. And Michigan's hate crime that we have one hate crime on the books, and that is called ethnic intimidation, name of the crime. Now, every crime in the state of Michigan, well, anywhere you go, really, the crimes are made up of elements. And you have to have each element or you don't have the crime. So with ethnic intimidation, we have certain elements that have to be met. Number one, a person is guilty of ethnic intimidation if that person maliciously, with specific intent, which is there's a difference between a specific intent crime and a general intent crime. Specific intent crimes, you meant the harm. General intent meant you meant the action, but not necessarily the harm. So it's a specific intent to intimidate or harass another person because of that person's race, color, religion, gender, or national origin, and does any of the following. Causes physical contact with another person. So basically we're talking some type of a physical assault. Damages, destroys, or defaces any real property of another person. So we're talking also, it's called malicious destruction of property. It's not your property, belongs to somebody else, and you're defacing it, damaging it, destroying it. Threatens by word or act described in subdivision A or B. So you're threatening the assault. You're threatening to, damage something, throw a rock through somebody's window, whatever. And there's reasonable cause to believe that an act described in A or B will occur. So you have the threat, and it's reasonable to conclude that the person may follow through on their threat. Okay? A lot of times we'll see this in other statutes too, where it says, like even with simple assault, it put the person in fear of an immediate battery, which a battery is the actual physical punching. The assault is the name of the statute, and it can be like an offer or an attempt. But for assault, if I put you in fear of receiving a battery, and it would put a reasonable person in fear, right? So it has to be something that would put a reasonable person in fear. So we got that, and then, which way am I going here? Oop. Okay, so to break that down into, and these are all ors. So a person guilty of ethnic intimidation, if malicious, specific intent, because of these, does any of the following. So these become an or then. You have the physical assault, or damage, destroy, or threaten to do the same. So hopefully that makes sense. That's the criminal statute we have in Michigan. And then if somebody does that, it is a felony. So they can be charged with that. But keep in mind, like I said, every crime is made of elements. And if you're familiar with the concept of double jeopardy, you can't be charged for the same crime twice, right? Or, be found guilty and charged again. However, so certain crimes will have what's called a lesser included offense. So basic on the offenses, you have specific elements, and it may be like, breaking and entering, may have the crime of breaking. Well, we can't also charge you with the MDOP because you broke to get in, because that's part of the burglary. So burglary is the more serious offense, so you charge that one. But if you have another offense or element outside of that, you can charge that one as well. So when we have some of these crimes, it's also possible we could have the ethnic intimidation plus an additional crime. But it's going to be very fact-specific. So depending on what we have in the situation, I don't like to get into hypotheticals because each one is going to be dependent on its own fact pattern. And then we also have this. So in the state of Michigan, all law enforcement agencies are required to report to the state, and we do it, it's through Michigan Incident Crime Reporting, also known as MICR. We have to report, and we report it pretty much on all crimes, and then Michigan turns around and reports to the feds. So if you ever read the annual crime in the United States put up by the FBI, normally it comes out around May, June timeframe for the previous year. That's all based on what's called UCR reporting, Uniform Crime Reporting. So the feds only want the big crimes, the state wants them all, so we send it all to the state, and then they turn around and do the UCR reporting. One of the things that we have to report on, and this is for all crimes, so even if it's not ethnic intimidation, is there some type of racial bias reporting that's tied to that crime? So if it's, you can pick any of those, right? There's a whole bunch of them. And if you'll notice at the bottom, a lot of times, I thought it used to be up there. There is other on there too. So, because the list is quite lengthy that we have to select from, so they're not all in the PowerPoint. But, there's a lot of different classes that if this is part of their motivation, we are going to report that to the state, and then the state is going to in turn report that to the feds. Now, let's say, for example, one morning, kids start showing up at Holland High School, and there's a racial slur spray painted on the side of the wall in large letters. And you've got kids showing up, you've got parents showing up, other family, other people hear about it. How many people are being victimized by this? A lot, right? I mean, everybody who's involved, people hear about it. There's going to be a lot of trauma in our community that we'll be having to deal with. Legally, how many victims do we have? One. The school. It was their property that was damaged, right? So as we get involved now, we have to take it from a criminal aspect. Now, obviously, it's still going to be a big deal. And one of the things that can become challenging at times for us is how much information should we be releasing to the public when these investigations are going on? Part of it is to protect the integrity of the investigation. We often don't release all the information. Some of it also becomes privacy issues. So we can release suspects' names if we have a known suspect. If there's a danger to the public, part of it is we need to get this person arrested, off the street, whatever. They're armed and dangerous. But if we don't have that, or maybe we already have them in custody, then we generally can't release their name because now it's a privacy issue. Because we arrested them, they've not been arraigned yet. Once they're arraigned in open court, now it's public record and we can release it. So these are some of the things that we have to deal with as we're dealing with what information can we release and when can we release it. Part of it, like I said, protecting the integrity investigation. And there's also an element of where we also need to eventually, hopefully, get a criminal conviction. So just a good example, well, a significant one, when we get the homicides, stabbings, armed robberies, and we're putting information out to the media, we typically are withholding some information. Because, well, especially with like a homicide, we want to prove this person did it. There's plenty of times we also have to prove this person didn't, and this person didn't, right? So when we're interviewing somebody, if you find a suspect, we bring them in, we're talking to them, and they're sharing with us information. Here's what I did, here's what happened, here's where I hid the weapon, but this is not information that we released. The only person who could know that is who? The suspect who did it. So if they're telling us all that information, this goes to proving that their confession is actually legitimate. Because there have been cases in the country, especially at times people with mental health issues will go in, they see it, they read about it, they go in and confess to it, even though they weren't involved. But they're not going to know these details, right? That's why we have to do it. And there's times where we've, even some of the recent ones, we're sending detectives out of state because we got to verify alibis for other people to can prove they didn't do it, so we can make Sarah's job a little easier when it gets to her office. You know, so, but even with smaller crimes, the same thing is true. We have to protect the integrity of the investigation. So we do get pushback at times, why can't you release more? Why can't you tell us more? It's like, generally there's a reason for it. And sometimes it can be as simple in certain cases of, we don't want to tip our hand to the suspect. If we tell them what they know, they're going to beat feet and they're going to be out of town, and now we're going to have a hard time finding them. So that can play into it also. So there's a lot of different things. So when you have, you know, if we have, going back to the school situation, if we have that, you know, racial slur written on the wall and we're investigating it, public wants to know, what are we doing, where is it going, where the investigation is. You know, we want transparency. It's like, yeah, we'd love to be able to do that. We'll be as transparent as we can, but keep in mind, there's a lot of things at that time, at that stage of the investigation, we just can't release. But we'll get at what we can. And I think that's about the end of my stuff. Or do I have another slide? Nope. All right. Yeah, I did better on time this time than last time.
All right. I do want to thank Captain Buursma for being here today. We are so fortunate in our community to have Holland Public Safety. They do such amazing work. They keep us informed. When something does happen, you can go right online. They put the information right out there as soon as they're able to. So I just applaud the work of our Public Safety Department. Thank you. So now we have Sarah Matwiejczyk. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the questions. Are there any questions for Captain Buursma?
Well, it's put a positive spin on it, which already has a positive spin. Where do we report something wonderful that happens between people that are different from the person who's acting? For example, with Afghan refugees, it was my job to take them around and introduce them to places in town. Every place we went, Hollanders said, welcome. Where do we report that?
You can report that right to, I think it would be nice if you recorded it and send it into, post it. And I think that Mary Ann, is Mary Ann here? Mary Ann, how do we report good news?
If your agency is on social media, you could post that on your social media and tag perhaps the businesses that you went to. Would be a great way to do that. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Is there a place to report if it like doesn't rise to the level of a crime?
So we take non-crime calls every day. In fact, if you look at our annual statistics, we take more non-crime calls than we take crime calls. Neighbor disputes, family disputes that aren't criminal, landlord-tenant employment. So, you know, we don't mind coming and taking the initial report, and then we can figure that out. And there's plenty of times where we will get involved in mediating a situation, working with two people, you know, can we come up with a solution Generally, we're not going to do a long-term investigation on that, and it's not going to go anywhere, but we do a lot of that type of thing. So I don't know what the specifics are, but
Non-emergency 911 call number that you can call if you don't know for sure what jurisdiction you're in, like if you don't know
Yes.
for sure is this within the city of Holland, Ottawa County. Sorry. I'm just mentioning that there's a non-emergency 911 phone call that you can make. So if you, hi, Matt, how are you? If you don't think it's an emergency or you're not sure if it's a crime, but you need assistance, I would recommend calling that non-emergency 911 call. And then if perhaps it's in Holland Township and it doesn't involve the city of Holland, you're not going back and forth.
well, whether you need us and call 911 or whatever, if you need an officer, don't call the police station, because that's administrative stuff. You call dispatch 911 or the non-emergency 1-800-249-0911. And no matter where you are in Ottawa County, they'll send the correct agency. Anything else? All right.
Okay. So, right now, we're going to welcome. Oh.
I would not do very well with this.
So we're going to welcome Maggie Haveman-Gould and Bill Trenary
That works.
to
Yep.
do their presentation from the Lighthouse Immigrant Advocates. So thank you for being here, and here is.
We got 2 mics today. All right. Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Bob. Like Esther said, I'm Maggie. This is Bill. We work with Lighthouse Immigrant Advocates. This is my clicker, right? I'm the program director there. Bill is our staff attorney. I get to say I can't answer any of your legal questions. This guy probably can. But we're just going to kind of team up with our 2 different sides of the brain. Going into this, we wanted to talk about victim advocacy. With the services that we provide, there isn't a specific petition that you can send in for a hate crime. So part of our chat today is to talk about the vulnerable populations that we work with. They might be more prone to those kind of situations, but also just being advocates for those different groups, and how we can partner with the prosecutor's office, with the City of Holland, or other areas that would be helping identify those criminal pieces, or, yeah. So let's get into it. Is it this one? Okay, that's us. Before we talk about the different remedies, I want to talk about our services, because really, if you've never dealt with immigration, you don't know a lot about it until you need to know about it. So we do a lot of renewals. That's work permits, green card renewals, DACA. You can come to us if you're not sure what your remedies are. So that starts with a general consultation. This is my story. These are my travel patterns. What kind of remedies are available? That could lead to an adjustment of status. Maybe you're married to a U.S. citizen and you'd like to adjust based on that relationship. Could be a family petition. Maybe your fiance is in India and you'd like them to travel to the U.S., or mom is in the Philippines and you'd like her to come stay with you. We also do.
I love that you're trying to do a rundown of every immigration
Yeah,
case.
every possible case.
Good luck. We'd be here.
Yes. These are just samples. Waivers and FOIA. Waivers are really when you need to ask permission or forgiveness from the government when you've done something that they didn't like. A pretty brassy example would be, let's say I entered the U.S. as an undocumented individual and brought my undocumented children with me. If I sought a remedy later on, I would actually have to fill out a waiver because technically I smuggled my children into the U.S., which in my opinion just sounds gross, but that's kind of some of the waivers that we have to work with based on your travel history or how you got into the U.S. FOIAs you can use in any situation. Freedom of Information Act. We use them a lot to see what someone's immigration history is, what they filed, what they haven't, but really you can use that in many ways. Citizenship can kind of feel like an end goal. These are my favorites. Last time we met, I was saying that we try to take a field trip every year to oath ceremonies because they are the coolest to go to. You see all different flags from different countries. You can hear all the names, how they're pronounced, and just see the beautiful part of our globe, all the different representation. So if you ever get the chance to go to an oath ceremony, I think the last one was at the Civic Center. I've seen them at Herrick, but I think they outgrew the space. It's pretty powerful.
If you're ever feeling, I don't know, slightly unpatriotic or not proud of your country, go to an oath ceremony and watch people who've wanted nothing more than to be American for a long time, take the oath and become Americans. It's great. It makes
It's
you feel
awesome.
great about this country.
Yeah. I let my fifth grader skip school to go to it, so it'll also make you the cool mom, just saying. And then humanitarian is a big one that we want to focus on today. We do a lot of humanitarian-based services, so to go into those. You've probably heard, you shared about Afghan families. We did a lot of asylum cases for recently arrived Afghans starting in 2021. We actually had to send so many that we would get large reams of paper boxes. We would print off all the applications, and then we would refill it with all the petitions that we mailed off to the government. And I lost count how many of those boxes that we shipped off. USPS knows many of our staff by name. Yeah. So asylum is a big piece. Violence Against Women Act is if you are the victim of domestic violence, you can actually have a remedy based on that happening to you. U visa is if you are the victim of a violent crime. T visa, there are many of these for different categories, is trafficking victims. And then the final one we'll talk about is temporary protected status. That's a temporary status based on kind of how rough of a state your country's in. That list varies a lot depending on what your home country is facing, and if the US government says, ooh, it's looking rough there, we'll offer temporary protection for now. This next slide, I want to highlight things that we need to remember. So some of us here might directly benefit from immigration benefits. Some of us might work with them. Some of them might be helpers in the community. Some might work in schools or different public-facing services. So these are really good reminders to understand what you need to keep in mind when we're looking at different humanitarian remedies. So for asylum, whether it's affirmative or defensive, our office can distinguish what that is. Don't worry about that part. But you have to file for asylum within 1 year of arriving in the US. So to take our example of Afghans again, we had a 1-year deadline of when we had to send that application. If you miss that deadline, you can no longer apply. Afghans in particular, they actually got it extended to 2 years, which is unheard of, but because there was such a large group coming in, our office managed to send them all within a year, just so that everyone knows. We are a significant percentage of those Afghan cases that were sent in a timely manner. But if you know of a new arrival that left a traumatic experience in their home country, help them remember you got to do it within a year or you lose that remedy. For VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, and though it says specifically for women, it's for any gender. I think statistically, it's obviously happening to women more frequently. This remedy can only be used if the perpetrator is a legal permanent resident, so someone with a green card, or they're a US citizen, and the relationship is spouse, parent, or child. So if an uncle were to abuse you, this remedy would not work. It has to be those relationships, and that perpetrator has to have some kind of status. And it's meant to encourage people to report on those crimes. U visa and T visa, this is where it is really important for our prosecutor's office to partner, because you have to have a police report for these items, except for T visa if you're under 18 years old. So if you're the victim of trafficking, if you're under 18, you don't necessarily have to help with that investigation, but the only way that you can get immigration remedies and get a green card from these services is if there's a police report and you're assisting with that process. Yeah. And then finally, the temporary protected status, as I mentioned before, you have to be on the list at the right time. So that list fluctuates a lot. Take, for example, the Ukraine. More recently, they were placed on the TPS list because of the war going on between Russia and Ukraine. Before that, they weren't on the TPS list. There wasn't this temporary protected status, but the U.S. identified many Ukrainians based in the U.S. need assistance. They can't return to their home country. Therefore, TPS was enacted for their country. That list varies a great deal. We've run into it with our office that someone's from this country, they were present in the U.S. at this time frame, but we're off by 2 years to qualify for that remedy. So, what'd I miss?
You didn't miss anything. I just want to talk a little bit more about
Great.
VAWA, U visa, T visa, and to some extent TPS, and just give a little deeper background on the purpose of the law. I think it's not too much of a stretch to say that immigration law is this Frankenstein monster where new stuff gets sewn onto the existing law. The INA, the act that controls immigration, is constantly being updated, and I assure you it is not updated by taking things out, it is updated by adding things to try to solve problems. This stuff, VAWA, which I know it says Violence Against Women Act, the effect of that act was to add language to the INA, to the Immigration Act. U visa, same thing. T visa, same thing. They've been grafted onto existing law because before these existed, what would happen is there would be, let's say, a domestic abuser who was a United States citizen, and that person would say, aha, I know you can't report me because then you'll be deported, so I gotcha. Or with U visa, crime, organized crime would say, aha, you could be a witness against me, but I know you won't because you would be deported, so I gotcha. And so those have been solved in a way, but they're only solved insofar as people know that they are available to them. So witnesses to crimes, when you think of a witness to a crime, U visa. And we really do, I'm not just saying this because you're in the room, your local government's great on this. It's super by the book, easy to deal with. I'm dealing with other counties all the time, and it's just never quite as clean. It's just never quite as good on U visa, so thank you. Kent's pretty good too, but I would say Ottawa County is probably the best. T visa, same thing. T visa that's kind of a catch-all for some other stuff. It includes a lot of agricultural workers, which we have in our community. That got reported in New York Times last summer. It was kind of a big, we made the news, Ottawa County. There's also a deferred action that's not technically U visa, it's not on this list, but when you hear DACA, you think of children who have been brought to the United States as very young people and have essentially grown up in the United States and are Americans by every standard that I think matters except for the legal one because they weren't born here. There's a different form of deferred action that exists for farm workers who have been something short of trafficked, and there's a real gray line. I think trafficking is it's a real gray area in the law because what is trafficking? Obviously, if you bring somebody to the United States to work and don't pay them, that is going to be trafficking. What if you pay them $0.25 per hour? Is that trafficking? What if you pay them $1 per hour? Is that trafficking? And so people know this and tend to try to stay just across the threshold of getting caught, and it's really a dirty game that gets played in our immigration system. When that happens, there is a new program for deferred action if there are workplace violations, especially that have to do with agriculture, and somebody comes forward in a civil action to report a business for that. They can be protected as a witness and potentially obtain deferred action and potentially obtain a visa to testify that can be turned into status under some circumstances. So again, if somebody is being exploited, there may be a remedy that has been grafted on the law because we've been doing this, we've been at this game for a while, and we've thought of a lot of the ways that people get exploited, and many of them are now reflected in the law. That's what this list is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is why we team up. Okay, one last thing I want to mention are just processing times, because I think if you understand how long these remedies take, it really puts things into perspective. So if we're going in to renew our driver's license or tags on your plate, it's kind of a quick process. But if you look at our asylum cases, the US government is supposed to respond within 150 days. So they should give us a response in 3 months. For our Afghan individuals, again, there was a lawsuit filed because the government was taking so long. We filed 287 asylum claims in 2022. I think we're up to about 170 of those we finally are getting responses on. And that's well past the 2-year mark. So we're not getting the same turnaround that we're supposed to. Those are taking years to process. We have some cases in our office that they sought asylum and they had their final interview to take place in 2020, and then it was canceled because of the pandemic, and now are finally rescheduled to this year. So if you're thinking renewing things kind of feels quick, these are lives that are still going on and waiting for that final decision. VAWA cases,
If I can tag on one
Yeah.
more thing there. In many instances, there might be somebody who made it to the United States, who, let's just say, escaped Kabul. Let's say what it is. And they're waiting on their asylum claim to come through. They have a valid asylum claim, and when it gets processed and they become an asylee, then they are able to petition, say, an I-730 to get a family member a visa. So just because they're here doesn't mean their entire family is here. They may have people whose lives are in danger abroad, but who cannot obtain a visa to escape that situation until the asylum claim is processed. So when we're talking about asylum, we're not just saying, I think the sense is, while you're here, you're safe, you know, if it takes 2 or 3 years, whatever. There are other things to consider, and many times those things to consider are family members like kids, wives, parents, whose lives may be in a very precarious situation somewhere else in the world.
and I think if we toss the hate crime or racial incidents on top of that, for our different community members that are coming in, they didn't leave their home country because they wanted to. They fled. You know, our Afghans in particular, I can remember the big old bellies of U.S. military planes filled with families and individuals just trying to stuff in to get somewhere safe. You know, they're reestablishing themselves here, but I know we have a lot of military men that left right on a plane, didn't say goodbye to their families, spouses and children are still back home, and they still can't apply for them as they wait for asylum to be processed. So when we look at racial incidences, we need to be aware of new populations coming in, how we can be welcoming, how we can embrace the differences in the culture and the language and the food. If you have ever sat on a carpeted floor with an Afghan family and had tea with them, it's a beautiful experience. Same thing with many of the different cultures and groups that we have. So understanding that trauma lens of waiting is really big. You know, our VAWA cases are currently taking 2.5 years to process. U visas are almost 6 years. That's a really long time. T visa is quicker at 1.5 years, but that's still after having to explain what happened to you, really share those traumas, and get someone to believe, oh yeah, I guess you are worthy of that checkbox of an approval. And TPS is quicker. In our office, we treat it more like a renewal, like it's quick, but still 8 to 15 months, that's not like getting new tags on your license plate. So puts things into perspective of waiting. Okay, this is just quick numbers looking at recent ports of entry. I know we have more limited time, so I'm just gonna focus on the countries that we've seen in the last few years. So in 2020, we saw top countries: Mexico, Philippines, Canada, India. 2021, Philippines and Mexico are still at the top, India, China. Then 2022, Ukraine. We can obviously see those numbers are gonna jump up as conflict happening in the Ukraine with Russia, Mexico, Philippines, Canada, still kind of up there. And more recently, in 2023, we have Haiti at the top, Mexico, Venezuela, Ukraine, Cuba. It just shows the trends coming in. And also, 2020, I thought it was interesting that Canada is the third country on the list. The border was really shut down, but there were still many, many people coming into the US. It was just restricted in many ways. Canada is probably one that was easier to cross just because of the relations. But you can see the trends, and it's usually falling in line with globally what's happening, and then we have a trickle effect. I'm not surprised at all that Haiti is at the top for 2023, and I can assume it's gonna stay at the top for 2024 based on current happenings in their country. Yes, I think, sorry, my eye is watering. I think whoops, wrong one, this one. If you look at New York Times, you would get a different sense of what countries would be coming in and seeking help and assistance than the countries that are really in a different focus. Yeah. One last chunk of numbers. We've got U.S. population about 1.1 million in 2023. That makes up 13.6 of the U.S. population are immigrants. It's a really big part of our community. It offers just a lot of depth to different cultures and languages and experiences. And more locally in Ottawa County, about 5.4% of the population are immigrants. There's some really interesting stats. You can read them as you go, but one I wanted to highlight, that 1 in 4 immigrants have limited English proficiency, and I think it can be skewed as, if only they would learn English. I think what we need to understand is they have also their own native languages. So many of our Afghans specifically, I keep using them as an example, but they're a great example. They speak 2, 3, 4 languages, and it's remarkable. So we need to remember that they're still coming with rich culture, rich language, rich experiences, rich memories from their home country, and that's just going to add to what we have locally. It also can set up for tension if we're not respecting and understanding those perspectives, especially when we look at biases and such. Okay, this is where Bill's big brain comes into play. We sometimes do a whole presentation on knowing your rights. This is just a brief one, but that's part of being advocates, how to know what your rights are, and also being aware what other people's rights are. If they're facing criminal charges or have some kind of victimization against them, knowing your rights is really important. So, Bill, can you call the police if you have status or no status?
Yes.
Yes.
You can call the police, or I can summarize the whole list very quickly because I answer these questions all the time for clients. Yes, you have rights. If you are standing in the United States, you enjoy the vast majority of constitutional rights, the baked in things that we think of as rights, like Bill of Rights. Yeah, you can't vote, you can't serve on a jury. There's a couple others that have to do with petitioning your government and traveling freely and the 14th Amendment, but whatever. You have rights. You can call the police. You have a fundamental right to medical care. You have a fundamental right to an attorney, a procedural right in many instances to have an attorney present with you. There's some gradation there depending on how important the procedure is, but in general, yes, you can speak to an attorney. That is a confidential conversation, no matter whether you have status, whatever. Based on standing on U.S. soil, these rights are enjoyed by all people who are here. There's case law on this. It is settled law. Do you have to open the door if somebody knocks? No, you don't. In your home, you are protected under the 4th Amendment. Now, don't fight with cops. People should not fight with police or law enforcement officers. This is really bad news. That's a tough job. Instead, document it. If you think that your constitutional rights have been violated, document it, film it if you can, write down what happens, make contemporaneous notes, and then fight about it in court later. Do not make law enforcement officers feel like their lives or safety is in danger. That is just really bad news. Also, you're probably violating the law if you do that. If ICE shows up at your work or school, do you have to let them in? No. And also, ICE likes to make up warrants. If you read the 4th Amendment, it speaks about warrants, and that warrant has to be signed by a judge or magistrate. Those are what I like to call real warrants, not warrants invented by an agency of the executive branch. So if you ever see a warrant in your life, it will be one of 3 warrants. It will be a state warrant signed by a state judge or magistrate, most likely a magistrate. That has judicial effect. If you see a federal warrant, it will be signed by a federal magistrate judge. That has judicial effect. And then if you see an ICE warrant, I don't know what to tell you to do. Don't fight with law enforcement officers, but absolutely you should challenge this later because it hasn't been signed by a judge, which is what the 4th Amendment says that it had to have force of law. And ICE officers like to, bluff their way through doors, I find. Something else that's nice is if you mark in a public space, this area is open to the public, this area is not open to the public, then the area behind the non-public door cannot simply be entered without a warrant, even though ICE likes to do this. And ICE has lost some cases, mostly in California, where they like to do this. They like to just enter through doors because they're not locked and then snoop around, and then later, I won't say bad things happen to them because bad things never happen, but they don't quite get what they want by just blundering through doors. That's what ICE likes to do. ICE likes to make its own warrants. It's like signing your own note when you were in school, like signing your own permission slip. Like, that's not how this works, but ICE is fond of doing that. So again, don't wrestle or fight with ICE agents. Don't argue with law enforcement officers, but be aware of the 3 types of warrants, and note that the ICE warrant is not signed by a judge or magistrate, which makes it has no constitutional effect other than to bluff your way through doors effectively. There's some sophistication here in terms of whether what is found by ICE officers is going to be used in the criminal context or in a civil context. I do find that the Department of Justice likes to dance back and forth between, well, it's a criminal proceeding when we need it to be a criminal proceeding, and then it's a civil proceeding when we need it to be a civil proceeding, and then they try to make good on these warrants. But again, defend your rights by recording, making contemporaneous notes, and fighting about it later by calling a lawyer if you think that somebody has entered your home when they couldn't enter your home because they didn't have a warrant. That applies to everybody, immigrants, non-immigrants, citizens alike. We're going to talk about driver's licenses next.
Yeah, it's
'cause I wanna
coming
get to
up.
that.
All right, next one. I mean, what we're trying to focus on is really knowing your rights. The police want to hear if a crime happens. The prosecutor's office wants to participate with that process. We want to make sure that people have opportunities to seek remedies, know when you have a warrant that's worthy or not. And driver's licenses offer a lot of accessibility. Yeah, Bill,
Yes.
who
So-
can get a driver's license in Michigan?
There's a long list. I suggest you go to, if you're curious about this, the Secretary of State has a great little corner of their website dedicated to this issue. If you listen to the news, every immigrant comes in and wants to immediately vote in elections. That's not true. What my clients really care about is reuniting with their family first, and then being able to work legally and drive. That is what folks care about, their daily life, because they're people like any other people. This is kind of the things that I care about too, and it makes perfect sense to me. There's a treaty that our government has signed with darn near every other country in the world. There's a couple standouts that aren't on there, the ones you might suspect. Iran's not on there, North Korea's not on there. Afghanistan is not on there. What this treaty says is if you have a valid foreign driver's license from one of these countries and a translation of that driver's license, and you carry those with you in your car, you are legal to drive in Michigan or anywhere in the United States. It's the same thing as driving in Michigan with an Ohio driver's license. It's a driver's license issued by a different sovereign, say Mexico, that has signed the treaty with our federal government, and as long as our law enforcement officers can read that license in English, aka there's a translation, you're good to go to drive in the United States based on a federal treaty. A lot of people don't know this. And I have a lot of people who come in to my office who have valid driver's licenses with them, and they say, how do I get a Michigan driver's license? I say, this is very simple. We'll just get Angel in here to translate it because his Spanish is perfect, and we translate it in 10 minutes. And I say, carry this paper with you, carry your driver's license with you, carry the translation with you in a little Ziploc bag. We go to the kitchen, get them a Ziploc bag, and they carry it in their glove box. A lot of people don't know that. I spend an inordinate amount of my time doing these sort of things. It's kind of crazy how you spend 90% of your time doing 10% of the things. This is a really common one. And then oftentimes you can visit a consulate. So let's say I'm from, I don't know, some other country that is in the United States, and I can't get a Michigan driver's license for whatever reason, but I can visit the consulate in Chicago for my home country. Great. Will they issue you a driver's license? Because if they will, just get their driver's license and the translation, and then you are not violating Michigan law, which really is the point. Don't violate the law if you can help it.
In
Yeah,
your
that's a good one.
the packets are from our office with a lot of information about our services and such, but they're actually copies of the treaty in both English and Spanish. One of the reasons why we recommend keeping it in your glove box is you might get pulled over and the officer may not know what that treaty means. So it's helpful just to have the treaty, have the translation, and your license.
I think I've seen that both ways too. I think I've seen, I think one officer who I suspect didn't know the law on purpose, but I've seen a couple of other officers who I honestly believe just didn't know this was a thing. And so it helps if you can just show the officer the law, because just like lawyers, not every law enforcement officer knows every single law on the books all the time, and you can help them out.
Very true.
It has to be a valid, unexpired license issued by a country that has signed that treaty, which, if you want to know which countries, is Peru on there? I happen to know it because I just looked it up. That's why I thought of it. But if we were ever not sure, we can go to the Secretary of State's website. They have really good information on this. You can just look and see which countries are in, which countries are out.
Now, if you're not on the treaty, there is a shorter column of countries not part of that treaty. That's where you would have to have status within the state of Michigan
Yes.
to obtain a driver's license. There are, I believe, in Illinois, you
Yeah.
can get driver's licenses without status. There have been bills in the works in hopes of, I believe they're called drive safe bills. We've advocated for that, just because it gains access to so many things. People are able to work. People are able to drive their kids to different things. Holland, we love the Max bus, but it's not going to get you very far within our community. And having that driver's license really opens up a lot of things for you.
And then, yeah, go ahead.
I
Yeah.
have an unexpired German international driver's license. Germany's not on either one of these lists.
Ooh.
Germany is not on either list.
Neither list. And Deutschland or Germany. Where is it? Aleman.
Oh, you might have the Spanish one. There should be a Spanish copy and an English one. There we go. It is in Spanish and
That's-
English. We don't have German.
That's why
though.
we have questions. That's
Yeah,
exactly why we
that's
have
great.
questions.
Okay.
I believe if somebody has a license from another country, but also has a license from the United States license supersedes that one, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, that's my understanding. Yeah. I've never actually seen, and maybe you could comment on this, I've never seen a ticket issued on that basis, though. So I'm not sure if you,
The ticket would be based on your United States driver's license.
yes, I understand what you're saying. I don't think you could ever run afoul of the law by presenting a Mexican driver's license, let's say, with a translation and the law, and then the officer says, well, but actually you have an Ohio license, and I know about that, so I'm going to give you a ticket for showing me the wrong license. I don't think that is,
Not for showing the wrong license, but say if that Ohio license was expired or suspended, you could get a ticket for that.
Got it.
So if you have an Ohio license that's suspended, but you have a Mexican
Yeah.
license that's old, the Ohio
Yes.
license you would supersede, and
Yes.
you could get a ticket for driving.
and the key word
I only
there,
bring that up because you mentioned having two different licenses, so I was like, yeah, okay, but the United States license is what the officers are gonna have.
yes, and the key word there is suspended. If you've done something wrong that caused your license to get, yes, so I know, yes. So DUI is the classic, like, I got my license suspended. You're not going to get around that by going to the consulate in Chicago and getting another license. That's not how it works. But if your license in Michigan expired, but wasn't suspended, then you could, in theory, go to the consulate, get a Mexican driver's license, and drive under the Mexican driver's license if you were a Mexican national.
Still think you could get a ticket for an expired Michigan license.
Okay.
Yeah, I wonder, like, if someone had, like, yeah, these are some,
You are going to get an "I told you so" or an apology email from me in the next week. It's probably going to be an apology email. Probably an apology email.
did anyone have questions? That's kind of how far we got with different services and thinking of different populations. Yeah.
As you were talking about ICE, how often are you seeing? Sorry, just wondering, when you talk about ICE coming with warrants and stuff like that, what is the prevalence that you're seeing that in Ottawa County?
Currently, not at all. Historically, it goes in waves. It depends on who's in the executive branch. I'm not going to make this discussion super political based on who's in the executive branch. I'll leave you to connect the dots. Currently, ICE's focus is almost entirely criminal. So if you would like ICE to be involved in your life, definitely do crimes. That is the way to make that happen. Other than that, you're likely not to encounter ICE in Ottawa County, so far as I know.
Can you give us some idea of the number of people that you've processed asylum for and what the rate of acceptance is?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was the number of asylum cases that we've done and the rate of acceptance. So we barely did any asylum until our Afghans arrived in 2021. We screened over 350, forgive me the number, to see if they were eligible for asylum. Because just because you set foot in the US and you say, I want asylum, you actually have to qualify, you have to be eligible, because if you apply for asylum and they find that it's a frivolous asylum case, you can be barred for life. So it's not just like you can willy-nilly throw out asylum claims. So we screened our Afghans. Mostly everyone was eligible for asylum, if not a higher level, because they were very high up with the US military and they had special immigrant visas. Those ones we cleared out because they would have a quicker process. Of the asylum, or the Afghans that we screened, went from 350 to 287 asylum applications that we sent out in 2022. Like I said, I think we've gotten all approvals so far. That's not always the case. I was just doing stats and numbers recently. There's a great website that you can use. I might have had this in the last presentation. If you have an attorney represent you, your likelihood of approval goes way up. But I think from 2001, this is just national, 2001 till now, almost 800,000 asylum applications have been adjudicated or decided on, and 56% of those have been denied. So you have a less than 50% chance. Now, if you go in and send your asylum application and you're not represented at all, I think there's a 13 or 14% approval rate. I don't know if that's because the application's not being sent in, if it's missing vital details. I mean, we throw the kitchen sink at it. It's photos, it's, we talk about graffiti on the wall. We have pictures of different graffiti on the wall against our clients, or threat letters, or statements from other people. So we try to give as much evidence as possible. We also have to let some clients know, sorry, we know that you've faced a lot of trauma, a lot of hardship, but you didn't have a direct threat against you, so you wouldn't be eligible for asylum, which is hard. It's not, Quasimodo, we enter the church and say, I want sanctuary, protect me. It's a much more elaborate process. So we've been fortunate that we've had 100% success rate so far.
And part of that, we have an attorney at the office. He's not here right now because he's busy doing asylum claims at the office. His name's Sam Fifelski, and he's absolutely killing it on asylum right now. He's not only all the things that you mentioned, but they do full prep, like a mock hearing, where they'll have people come in and cross the witness as if, they're doing like trial prep essentially on asylum claims, which is simply just, it's how it should be done. It's not how it's done at most places because the volume is so high. A lot of people treat it like a volume game, and he puts in just insane working hours. So shout out to Sam. He's doing a great job.
Yeah. And if you're aware of new arrivals, we've had to kind of modify our system just because we can't meet that demand as much. We learned shipping off boxes of tons of applications. Well, then you get all the documents back. So we do have a little bit of a screening process for any new arrival so that they can know much more rapidly if they're eligible for asylum, and then we can get them connected to a workshop to file those documents. So there was a question, yeah.
Could you clarify, Maggie, the difference between asylum seeker, refugee, and immigrant?
Yeah. So a question was clarifying between an asylum seeker, refugee, and an immigrant. An immigrant is someone born elsewhere living in another country. That's a pretty direct one. A refugee is someone fleeing their home country and seeking refuge elsewhere. The legal definition is the UN has marked you as a refugee. An asylee is the same thing, but the UN hasn't said, okay, while you're still abroad, the UN has to say, yep, stamp, you're considered a refugee. Then you're entering the US with status. So our Afghans, for example, everyone that entered with status. Our more recent arrivals from Haiti or Venezuela, if they don't have any kind of status when they enter, they're considered asylees. So that's the difference legally between the two, but the term across the board is similar. You're fleeing your home country and seeking refuge. It also unlocks different federal funding, or it doesn't. So our Afghans had resettlement agencies help with housing and work permits and all of that. Someone who enters without status does not have federal support for housing, work permits, all of that. Does that make sense?
And if I can just tag on, in a nutshell, the difference between a refugee and an asylee is, refugee is somebody who comes from a generalized situation that has been marked as really bad. The United States government has outsourced that to a UN agency that marks, there was a natural disaster, and we're going to take refugees, or there was a political conflict, we're going to take refugees. It's generalized. Asylum, one generally has to prove something that is particular to them as an individual. The government of this country is after me because I said stuff. I'm part of a particularized social group in this country, and the government of that country is after those folks or is allowing them to be persecuted in a specific way. That's the difference between asylum and refugee. And an immigrant is somebody who intends to live in another country. So not just if you're here, like we've all met somebody with a J visa, like a student visa. That's not technically an immigrant. I know we'd think of them as an immigrant, but they don't intend to remain permanently in the United States. They're here studying. That's not technically an immigrant. Currently, about 13% of the United States population is immigrants. That includes Americans. People who weren't born here, have lived here for 40 years and are now citizens, are considered immigrants because they weren't born here. They moved here with the intent to remain living here.
Okay, and we're past
We're
time.
I'm
So
sorry.
here we go, Esther. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Isn't that interesting? Fascinating. Okay, we are going to take a 5-minute break, but we're running behind schedule. So what I'd like to do is give you a 2-minute break.
Okay, my name is Sarah Matwiejczyk, and I'm the Chief Assistant Prosecutor in Ottawa County. I'm serving in my 23rd year here as a prosecutor in Ottawa County. This is not Jennifer Gustafson. This is Amber Schuster. She is one of our victim advocates and has been for the last 5 years. Jennifer's poor family dog died this afternoon, and she didn't want her kids to come home to that. So speaking of trauma and how she is such a great service to victims, she'll be a great service to her children, but she's definitely needed there today. So please give Amber a little bit of grace today, as about an hour before we came here, I said, here's the slides, Amber, you're doing the first several, and then I'll just got your back from there. So I will start by saying that Amber and I are very passionate about our jobs, and we're very passionate about victim advocacy. And so hopefully you learn that throughout, and you'll kind of find what we can and can't do within the parameters of our office. The reason when we did this training before, we learned why we were important here. We kind of were trying to piece all of our roles together and like, how do we all fit together? Well, we fit together because we kind of show you the whole spectrum of how a human being handles these types of situations. Ethnic intimidation situations can be very civil, and we've learned how that can happen. It also could be very criminal, and we're going to talk a little bit about our involvement in that with the criminal system. But everybody needs help from the very beginning to the very end. So what I'm hoping you can take away from today is to learn that we as a community are awesome. We work very well together, and we have services from the beginning and to the end. And the more we can spread that to our community members that can provide that to our victims of crime or ethnic intimidation, whether it be civil, whether it just be small, whether it be large, it's important to us, and these are the different people that care about it and that you can turn them to for help. All right? Now I get to turn it over to Amber again. She's going to do fantastic.
All right, so ultimately, we start with our cases are most of the time traumatic experiences for whether it's witnesses or victims. It's a traumatic experience is a scary, dangerous, or violent event that can happen to anyone or be witnessed by anyone. There's no boundaries regarding age, gender, status, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. It is literally open. It is something that threatens the life or physical integrity of a person or of someone important to that person. So the parent, child, sibling, other family members. It causes an overwhelming sense of terror, fear, helplessness, hopelessness, horror. It overwhelms the capacity to cope, is what a traumatic experience is. It produces intense physical effects such as a pounding heart, rapid breathing, trembling. As a result of trauma, it can influence person's ability to feel safe and to trust and engage in the justice system and others that are trying to help. So those in our communities and different resources that we have. Some of those people with a traumatic experience are going to have a hard time accepting that. The types of trauma, we have acute trauma, which is a single event that lasts for a limited time, and there's chronic trauma, the experience of multiple traumatic events, often over a long period of time. Those vary in intensity and duration for both types. For a trauma response, we need to learn how to recognize it. In our office, we often start after police involvement, then the report comes to our office, and that's where we then make contact with the victim of an event and the case that has happened. We want to know, we explain to them kind of where we're at. Oftentimes they come to us with the thought that it is them versus the suspect or the defendant at that point. So we want to explain where we're at, what has happened in the steps, where the law enforcement has come out, they've taken the report. Now it's the state of Michigan. We have to respect everyone's experience. Everyone has been through different things. We don't often know that. And so it's through talking to them and getting to listen to them and hear where they're actually at that we're able to do our jobs appropriately. We differentiate between past and present for them. That helps us determine the resources that will be helpful for them. Is this an instance that has happened multiple times? Is this a chronic trauma? Is this an acute trauma where it's happened one time? What resources can we help you with? Is this something that is long lasting that we can look at potentially other things in that case? We have to help the person identify and put into words the actions beneath the feelings. We read the room. What do they need? Do they need a friend? Do they need somebody to just yell at? I've had that happen. I know Sarah's had that happen to us. Do we sit in chaos with them? That's a lot of our job, is we sit in their chaos. I can't fix what happened to them, but I can be there with them to walk them through the process. It's scary. And that's part of how we respond. I'm empathizing, right? As an advocate, that is my job, is to sit there and empathize with what they have been through, to let them know that at the end of the day, they are not alone in this process. We are there to help them with whatever that need is, whether that is me sitting there having a conversation with them and immediately sending an email to them, because in a trauma response, you might not be able to remember everything that I've said to you. The process of how the court process works is insane, and it is frustrating for even people that haven't gone through the traumas. And so for me to type out that email for them so they can have it in writing to reflect and to actually see again in writing after they've had that time to sit with what we're doing. We're reassuring and realistic about what we can do. I can't make things go away for them. I don't promise them that everything's gonna be okay. I don't know that. I can promise them in the situation that I will be there to help them through the court process. That I have resources that I can offer them, that we have a great community, and that's what we tell them. Helping them express their concerns to others. That is one of the biggest jobs we have, is we sit there with our prosecutors, and our prosecutors are greatly focused on this case so that they can get the justice that is deserved. I can sit there and help them express what their concerns are to the prosecutor. We have a great working relationship where we can express what needs to be the bottom line. What is their concern? Is it the financial concern that having this person out of the house is now causing? Where are they at in the trauma that they've experienced? We often, if they have a choice, we offer choices every time we can. We don't want to sit there and tell them this is the end of you don't have options. A lot of times in these situations, the cases we see, a lot of, especially like domestic violence cases, they don't have choices. We offer whatever we are able to. And we encourage them that they've done the right thing, that they are going to, we are going to do our best in that situation. Our trauma-informed advocacy, there's obviously do's and don'ts in that situation. So we help others to understand the impact trauma has had on the victim, whether that is other people in the office, or whether that's other people in the court. We are there to walk people through what that means to be in their shoes and what they have tried to experience. We promote the importance of safety, and we differentiate ourselves from other system providers, meaning I can't be their therapist. I can't, no, Sarah can't be their therapist, but we can offer the resources that the community has for them to get in contact with those people. We don't react in anger or heat of the moment. We don't take it personally. Like I said, we've had people yell at us. That is where they're at in that moment. And I sit with them and I let them do that. And most of the time at the end they apologize because they are not mad at me. And I know that. And I sit there and I say, that's okay. You take the time to be angry. Feel your feelings. That is important. And so that behavior is what we take at face value for them.
It's me now. So, has anybody ever heard of vicarious trauma? Okay, so that kind of ties into where Amber left off. All those times that Amber and all of you in the community that help advocate for victims and can sometimes be the person that they come to and not always treat with the best of manners and love and care, you deal with that day in and day out, over and over and over again. So while Amber's up here with a nice little smile talking about how people yell and scream at her, she takes that home with her every single day. So I want to kind of, before I start talking about what we do at the prosecutor's office, I just want to recognize that vicarious trauma, that in a way all of you who are helping victims are also dealing with that victimization, and you need to take care of yourself and recognize that. So that's my little pitch for all of you to take care of yourselves, because I don't think there's enough training about that, because if you don't do that, you're not going to be able to get up the next day and help these victims of trauma. Okay, victim services, what we do. So first and foremost, for the prosecutor's office to get involved with helping victims and advocating for victims, we need to have a crime actually charged. So Amber's services are not available to just anybody out there. So that's when all of your services come into play. Ours can't come into play until somebody is actually charged with a crime. So if somebody from the Holland Department of Public Safety sends in a police report and we review it and we deny it, our office doesn't have any involvement in it. Once we charge with a crime, and if it fits under the statute for victim services, so there's a statute that specifically talks about what crimes we are going to have our victim advocates involved in. It's called the Crime Victims' Rights Act. If it's one of those listed crimes, then our victim advocacy program steps in, okay? Now, that doesn't mean if you're not one of those crimes, we're not going to help you. We obviously will. It's just specifically with all the crimes that we have here in Ottawa County, we have to make sure that we're not overburdening too much, but we're always here to help. The number one thing is, like I said, we assess, as soon as we charge a crime, we assess whether or not the Crime Victims' Rights makes that crime fall under the statute for a Crime Victims' Rights Act. If so, we immediately get a victim advocate assigned. The victim of that case will have one victim advocate assigned, and that victim advocate will stay with them throughout the entire case. We, just so you know, in Ottawa County, are one of the largest growing counties. We are the largest growing county in the state, and we have 4 victim advocates and 1 victim advocate assistant. They are very busy, but they are very good. So we are able to still have them assigned to one particular person. And it's also hard because we have an office in Grand Haven and Holland. We have courts in Hudsonville and at Fillmore. We've got them all over the place. So keep in mind the challenge, but they're able to keep up with it. As Amber kind of alluded to, they're a liaison between the victim and the prosecutor, because the prosecutor's in there with a goal, and that goal is to hold somebody accountable for the crime that they commit. That's what we want to do. We don't have clients. We represent the entire community. We take into consideration defendants, witnesses, community, neighbors, and essentially the victim. But all of those people are who we're focused on, and that is our focus. And sometimes we can be very blinded when we're in the middle of a trial and the victim has questions. What's going on? What does that mean? What just happened? What was the objection? Why is everybody leaving? That's when Amber steps in, and she's able to give that hand-holding and that information and help with that process. And sometimes, like she said, come up to me and say, hey, Sarah, the victim's not knowing what's going on here. Can you help me out? Can we have a conversation when you have a minute, when you have a break? So it's a great, great, great service. Restitution requests, I think that's kind of self-explanatory. And then mailings. So whenever, if people want to participate, if they don't want to participate, immediately when they're charged, we assess that it's a Crime Victims' Rights Act. They send a mailing. We send a letter to them saying, do you want to be involved in the process? Here's who we are. Here's your advocate. If you want to be involved, please send this paperwork back, and we will continue to update you on the process of the case, et cetera, et cetera. If they don't want any involvement, then they'll let us know or they'll ignore it. If later on they change their mind, happily take them back. This one, I'm not going to read through it. This one's really important. Jen Gustafson, she is our Domestic Violence Intervention Officer. This is very unique to Ottawa County, and we were one of the only counties to ever do this up until people started getting it. It was a pretty great program, and so they're starting to do it too. What it is with domestic violence cases, those are cases, obviously, where people are very closely involved in each other, right? Husbands, wives, parents, spouses, et cetera. Dating relationships, children in common. These are people who are really close together. They are definitely our number one situation where we have victims recanting, changing their mind, okay? They're being assaulted. They call the police in that moment when they need that help. A couple days later, they're starting to think, how am I going to pay for my cell phone bill? How am I going to pay for my car? Where am I going to live? Where are my kids? You know, all these different concerns. Life sets in, okay? And they start weighing the pros and cons. Am I willing to sacrifice myself for everything else in my life? And quite often people do. So the key here is, with this domestic violence initiative, is Jen goes to their home within 48 hours. She actually physically goes to the home of the victim to try to just let them know who we are. It's just a reaching out. It's saying, my name is Jen, here's my card, here's some pamphlets of services, we have charged a crime, and this is what we're here for you. You know, this is what we can do for you. This is how we can protect you if you have concerns. Just a reach out so they know they're not alone. Immediately, how do I pay for my cell phone? Immediately, he took the car, what do I do? We can help with those sorts of issues and questions, but we got to do it right away. Statistics are very clear. If you wait too long, we've lost it. If we lose it, I'm not going to be able to prosecute the case and hold people accountable, whether it be getting counseling, getting help, getting alcohol abuse treatment, whatever it might be, jail, I don't know. Domestic violence spans all kinds of different situations, but I can't help that victim unless that victim feels like they are safe and protected to continue with helping us with prosecution. So that's huge. Sometimes she'll go to these houses and she needs a police officer to go with them because sometimes the defendant is still living at the house. So it's a good initiative, but it definitely can be a little bit risky. So we make sure she does it during the daytime and she knows her limits. Language services. Obviously, this is a big thing. We do offer language services. We're still working on improving it. I think language services are getting better and better as we go along, so we're trying to keep up with that. Right now, we can make a phone call and have somebody do translations, but we are actively going with a program now where we can do it on our phones or on a tablet or on our computer. So we can have a live face show up as a translator pretty much 24/7, that we can have our victim or a witness present right there, and they can communicate face-to-face with this person on an electronic screen, and they can immediately translate. So essentially, it's about the closest to having a conversation with someone who speaks a different language as we possibly can. So we've been working very diligently on that. But most of our documents all of our documents are translated to Spanish. And if we have to get them translated in another language, we have means of doing so. Very simply, I think these are self-explanatory as to what our goals are. We want to make sure that victims know this is hard. Being involved in a prosecution is hard. It's the worst moment of somebody's life, and I'm going to ask you to repeat it once or twice in front of total strangers. And then you're going to be dependent on those total strangers to tell you whether or not somebody's going to be held accountable for the crime. It's a very difficult thing to explain. It's a very difficult process to go through. Our job is to make that the least difficult that we possibly can, and to offer sensitivity, to offer programs, to offer help, and just to, bottom line, let them know that we care. There's been times where we've had cases where we've come back with not guilty verdicts. It can be really tough, especially in domestic violence situations or ethnic intimidation cases. If we get not guilties, the number one thing I need those victims to understand is that we believed them and we were there for them, and that things are going to change for them because of the services that all this community has to provide. So it's to give them empowerment, to let them know there are people who are willing to listen. And so bottom line, even if we can't get that conviction, we hope that that's the end result of the process that our program works so hard to do. And any questions? Okay. Do you have a question? Oh, sorry, I went through that fast, I saw my time up.
So with the, thank you, the domestic violence initiative, so is it kind of just as soon as you receive a police report or something, then you go find them, or do they have to come to you?
Once we get a police report and we authorize a charge of domestic violence, she goes out and she seeks out the victim.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Yep, and if she gets no response, if they don't want to talk to her, so be it. She'll leave a card, let them know that we're available.
Okay, thank you.
Another thing that's important for her to explain is, especially with our public defender's office, they have private investigators. We need to let people know that who could possibly be talking to them. We have law enforcement officers. They're there for justice. They're there to be there for the victim and to try to have defendants be held accountable for crime. Public defender or defense, private investigators are out there for one purpose, and that's to get evidence to help their client. And it's very confusing for victims. They don't know. Somebody comes in being very kind, say, you know, I'm a law enforcement officer, because sometimes they used to be, and in a way they still kind of are. But it's what are their intentions? What are they there to do? So giving that information is part of it too.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you so much.
So I just want to thank Sarah and Amber for their work in the community. Lighthouse Immigrant Advocates also does some amazing work, and as I mentioned earlier, Holland Public Safety. Wow, we live in an amazing part of the world. I know we see a lot of interesting things happening in our community, but I want you to know there's a lot of good people working behind the scenes, making everything work. With that said, we're coming to the very last speaker. Her name is Kristin Travers from the Flourishing Collective. And I think that we've talked about some very heavy topics today, and we're going to end on a very light note, and she is going to help us walk through the process.
This brain is totally normal just to put down on a podium, just, normal things we do in our day. I'm Kristin Travers. I'm a therapist in our area and have been working within the mental health world for about 15 years. And I'm just so grateful to see all of the faces here today in my own community. I'm from Holland, so this is really encouraging to me. I want to also acknowledge that we could probably sit together for 8 hours a day for an entire week and talk about just trauma and still have things that we didn't learn yet. So I want you to know that as we talk about these things, we're scratching the surface. There is so much more than what we can cover today. And also, trauma impacts people so differently. We use the phrase a lot with different mental health diagnoses, but same for trauma of, if you've met one person with trauma, you've met one person with trauma. So also acknowledging that this looks different. So for so many people, it's really important too. All right, I haven't used this clicker yet, so we're gonna be learning together here. Good, okay. So this is just kind of what I'm planning on covering today. and our goals. But before we start, it's a very therapist thing for me to do. I'm wondering if we can just check in a second, because I don't know about you, but I'm sitting here listening to all our incredible speakers talking about really hard things, and I felt my shoulders coming up a little bit and my jaw a little bit clenched, because our bodies often are our first responders to when we feel stress or overwhelm. So we're gonna work through a body scan. If you're comfortable, have your eyes closed, your feet firmly on the floor, both of them, even though we do love to cross our legs. We're gonna close our eyes and just take a minute to go through our body right now and pay attention to how we're feeling. So I'm gonna start just by our breath. Make sure you're not holding that in, but that you're taking deep breaths, and pay attention to how that feels coming in and out of your body. I want you to think about your toes. Maybe wiggle them around a little bit, scrunch them out. And move up to your stomach. Are there any flutters or flurries? Any pits happening in there? Just acknowledge what that might mean for you as you've heard difficult things today. We're going to go to our hands. Are your hands and fists? If you can, put your hands on each knee with your palms up as an opening. Again, back to our lungs. I want you to take some really deep breaths. Now pay attention to your shoulders. Put them up by your ears, and then just drop them down. It's amazing how low our shoulders can get. And allow for your arms and your shoulders to relax. I want you to think about your jaw. If it's clenched, loosen that up. If the tongue is at the roof of your mouth, lower that down. And if you have thoughts swirling or worries sitting in your mind, I want you to kindly acknowledge them and allow for them to calm as we enter into this. So if you open our eyes, take another breath. I needed that. Maybe I was the only one who needed that up in front of all of you. But it is amazing how our bodies hold so much of the stress that we feel. So now we'll get going talking about trauma. With that. So we've had already a great introduction on what trauma is. So many of us think about trauma and think about PTSD, war veterans, because really that's where we first started learning about how trauma can impact people. So we think about flashbacks, we think about nightmares, and that is trauma. But as we've learned about the human brain, as we've learned about traumatic experiences, it is so much further and broader than that. So if we think about trauma from a definition, that first clinical definition is kind of what we would say trauma is. But now on the bottom, if we think about our human and life definition, it's an unnamed or unacknowledged pain or struggle. So it's really an experience where we are unable to cope with using our front functioning of our brain, our logic, our reasoning. It's when our brains and our brain stems and the inner brain take over. And that's where many of you, I'm guessing, have heard of flight, fight, freeze, fawn. Those are our trauma responses. So that's typically when we go into that part of our brain, that's a trauma experience. That doesn't mean that everybody has PTSD. There's a lot of trauma experiences. They range. There's different diagnoses. There's complex trauma. There's PTSD. So there was vicarious trauma. Lots of different experiences. But I just want you to think about trauma in a broader way today. There we go. So if we think about trauma, here's a list of some of the things that can cause that. Others that I thought were really impactful that so many of us in this room have also experienced are job loss, death and loss, a betrayal of a friendship, being ostracized by a religious community, secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. We see that a lot with people in the helping professions and foster care parents. harsh criticism from a parent that you've worked your whole life to please. Those are all examples of what trauma can be too. As you can see on the bottom, I talk a little bit about ACEs, and we're going to get to that in a second because that's an important piece as we think about trauma. But first, I do want to kind of talk about my friend over here. This is a brain. It's not real. I've actually had people ask me that, like, is it a real one? I'm like, it would probably be in fluid if it were. But this is anatomically correct. This is the size of an adult human brain, and it weighs the same amount. So I'll pass it around so you can kind of feel like this is what's inside of your brain. So I'm going to open it up here a second. Just so we can see inside. So as you can see, this outer part, especially towards the front, that's our prefrontal cortex. That's our place where we think logically. If we're in a calm state, we're thinking about things, even if it's a little overwhelming from a logical perspective, we're problem solving. That is the part of the brain that we feel most comfortable being in, and that we want to stay in as much as possible. Over here, sorry, balancing act here. So this is our spine. And so this is what connects to our brain. This is into our brain stem. So have you ever touched a hot pan and like your hand is quickly retracted? You didn't have to think about that. Your prefrontal cortex didn't say, this is hot. I would worry about a 3rd-degree burn. You should probably pull your hand away because then it's too late, right? So our brains instantly support us by going into this further part here and pulling our hand away without us even thinking about it. Like, that's cool, right? So if we think a little bit further, we could get into all of the medical terms and technical terms. I'm just going to call this our inner brain. This is where we go when we experience trauma. This is where our logic and reasoning goes out and our survival comes into play. When we're experiencing a traumatic event, often the blood rushes from our head and into our muscles so that we can physically respond if we need to, which takes away the prefrontal cortex ability to work, and this is where we go. So that's my little fun brain moment. Maybe I'll pass half. Can I pass a half a brain around to each side of the room? Just, again, normal life, guys. Thanks. All right. How many of you have heard of ACEs before? Just a raise of hands. Okay, great. A good number of you. And that's so encouraging because that means we're having great conversations around trauma impacts early on. So congratulations. And congratulations if you haven't heard of it. We're going to learn about it for the first time today. So ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So there are about 10 ACE factors that we consider when it comes to a child's experience that can cause for them to be at higher risk for trauma experiences and toxic stress. So those are physical, sexual, or verbal abuse, physical or emotional neglect, separation or divorce, a family member with mental illness, family substance addiction, imprisoned family member, or witnessing domestic violence. So those are kind of the 10 things that we assess when we think about adverse childhood experiences. Often when I'm talking about this, people start ticking those in their mind. Like, have I ever experienced those? So if this is something that you wonder about yourself, or if you have people in your life that you're like, hey, adverse childhood experiences, there's so many resources online, including quizzes that you can go and take and really gain an understanding of what maybe some of your life experiences play into who you are and how you function today. So from the numbers that I know, and we'll use them loosely, 67-ish% of people have 1 to 3 of those ACEs. If we think about further, 4+ is where we really think clinically that those people are our high-risk people. That's so many risk factors that we think the risks of them having long-term impacts of their trauma will play a part in their life. And as you can see, this is kind of a scale on how trauma can really impact not just our mental health, our emotional health, but our physical health, chronic illness, heart disease, Trauma impacts the functioning of our bodies and not just of our brains. Here's some symptoms of trauma that we experience. I'll let you read through most of them, but just kind of touch on a few. Just that sudden sweating and heart palpitations. Remember when we were doing our body scan, how our bodies pay attention to our stress first? This is really common with people with trauma too, where they might not even recognize right away that they're feeling unsafe, but their body is telling them first. More susceptible just to illness, people who get sick a lot. That's an interesting connection with trauma. More likelihood for alcohol dependency, for mental health disorders. They go on to outbursts that we maybe can't even explain. Like, I don't know why I went there, but I did. Self-blame, having a hard time trusting people, especially if we think about a child who's had adverse experiences. As adults then, having attachment disorders or the inability to create an effective attachment, that can impact them in their relationships as adults too. So just a few of those symptoms that we'll talk about. I think if we step back more broadly from the person and from the brain and think about the city of Holland, which is why we're here, it's really important for us to talk about what we would do in a situation of community trauma. A big, horrible situation. I know we've acknowledged that at the beginning. Thank you for mentioning that. So when we think about community level prevention, the typing is so small. So I'm just going to walk over here and we'll talk about it. There's things that we can do. So many organizations are represented today. So within our agencies and organizations, these are things that I hope collectively we can do together to prevent trauma experiences. First being strengthening economic supports to families. When we don't have our basic needs cared for, we're unable to function in the way we need to. So just simply as supporting economics to strengthen our families is one. Changing our social norms to support parents and encourage positive parenting. I'm a mom of 4 kids, and the amount of negative parent shaming or, oh, I can't believe their kid is screaming in the grocery store, and judgment that can come to parents is so isolating to those parents. So really focusing our energy on how do we come around families, how do we support those families that are struggling is another way we can prevent some of that increased trauma. Providing quality care and education early in life is another. Kind of touched on this one already, but enhancing parenting skills to promote healthy development. Early childhood is so important. Kids can experience trauma before their brains are actually recalling memories or able to pull back from memories, and that can still impact the way that their brain functions. And intervene to lessen harms and prevent future risk by enhanced medical care, access to services, those types of things. Something I didn't mention, but I want to, is a term called epigenetics. Have any of you heard of this before? I feel like a fancy science person, even though I'm in business of people when I say it. But what we're learning more and more about the brain and more about trauma is that if we have experienced significant trauma, our DNA can actually have markers. Our DNA isn't changing, but there's markers on our DNA that then if we pass on to our family or to our children, they have those markers as well. So they're more predisposed to some of those maybe flight, fight, or freeze responses because of epigenetics. So something, again, someday maybe we'll know everything about the brain. We're still learning, and it's just incredible and scary. So if we think about the community as a therapist, I also want to think about the person, because I'm sitting across from someone and we're talking about really hard things. So what I first do, and if you ever have someone share their trauma experience with you, is just acknowledging it. We hear often of like, oh, they're oversensitive, over a lot of different terms, right? Overstimulated, over all of this. So taking that over out of the picture and just saying, wow, that must have been a really hard experience. What you experience and what you're feeling is so valid, rather than coming from it of like, oh, you're over-responding, right? Connecting with them and others who may have shared the same experience. There's something so validating when someone else can say, me too, right? And therapists can't always do that, but connecting people within our community together who have those shared experiences can be really powerful and really healing for our clients. Also, not making assumptions. I think so many of us have our own experiences in our lives. And what we want to do is we want to connect and relate to other people. But when we do that, we run the risk of prioritizing our own experiences and not really validating and understanding what the person you're talking to is experiencing. So those are a few things that we can do on that individual level. Here's some of my resources, but I do want to talk about a few more things. Yesterday, my teenager got in my car. She's 15, and she said, do you know what date it is today? It was March 13. Does anybody know what that meant? March 13, 4 years ago, was her last day of school as a 6th grader. She didn't talk about it in class. It was just a date that was in her mind of like, gosh, I remember this day. And I remember how I felt. And I remember how scared we were. And I remember, Mom, how much you were on your phone, looking up graphs and looking up numbers of cases. And I think what is so difficult when we think about coming together around trauma is during COVID, we had to do the opposite. We were all experiencing stress and uncertainty and fear, and in some cases, loss and grief. But instead of being able to come together and gather and support one another, we were all tied up at home and told, no, you can't interact, which is so opposite of what we need as humans when we're experiencing something hard. So should our community experience a traumatic event, what my hope would be, as long as it's not a health pandemic again, is that rather than isolate, we come together. We provide opportunities for community, for listening, and we really engage with each other. Because if we think about the impacts that COVID had from our isolated place, we're still healing from that. Our kids are still remembering that. On the flip side, when I was young, I went to New York City on September 20, 2001. And that was a pre-planned trip. And I went to Ground Zero and experienced something incredible of people coming together, circles of strangers joining hands, listening to one another and talking. That's my hope for Holland. Not that we were to have a traumatic experience, but that if that were to ever happen, we put whatever aside and we show up for each other as a community. Being a Hollander, I've seen that play out already. I'm so grateful for each of you being here. That's a step in doing that. So that's my hope as we prepare and as we think about what traumatic experiences could be for our community. I'll open it up for questions if you have any. That was a lot. We maybe need some time to process. This is my information. I tag teamed this, so my colleague presented last time, which is why both of our names are on there. If you have questions or wonderings about resources or books you want to read if you want to learn more, please email. I'm a social worker. I love to connect people with resources. That's what my values are. So please reach out if you have any questions that way. All right? Great. I don't want to set that down then. I'll just hand it to you.
Kristin, thank you so much. Thank you for that exercise at the beginning of your presentation. I so appreciate that. I need to do that every day some days. So next steps. Look, there's a lot to do, and I'm not sure what the next steps are. You will be receiving a survey. Luann will be sending it out probably tomorrow morning. Please respond. We want to have programming that is relevant to the community. We want to continue this. We know that there's a lot there are a lot more resources in our community that we should come together so that we can learn about what's happening here, but also begin to make those networking connections that are so important. So I just want to send you off with a great big thank you. If there's ever anything that we can do for you here at the city, please let us know, and the presentation will be sent to you. Appreciate that you all took notes, and I probably should have mentioned that we would be sending out the presentation. Luann, were you going to say something? I was just going to say that very good. Okay, all right. Okay, thank you. Have a wonderful day. We finished 10 minutes early. Yay.